FlossTube. My name is Laura and I am the Nerdy Needle. I'm so glad you decided to join me here on my FlossTube channel today. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe this video. I'd really appreciate it. This is video number 4 in my series of 10 that I'm calling Introduction to Cross Stitch 101, 102, and 103. This series is designed to teach absolute beginning stitchers how to do cross stitch, so that by the end of the video series, at the end of the 10 videos, you'll have all the skills necessary to stitch any kind of cross stitch project that's available, whether it's a sampler or a full coverage piece or something in between. For more experienced stitchers, this series is a compilation of many of the commonly used stitching techniques. I've put timestamps in the description box below for each section so that you can quickly and easily reference whichever skill you want to review. Today it's all about the specialty stitches that are needed to finish one of these kits. So the ones that occur in these projects include backstitch and long stitch and French knots. Now, French knots are something that strike fear in the heart of many a stitcher. I really didn't like them very much in the past, but then I started practicing them on the perforated paper that these kits are stitched on, and I realized that that's a great place to practice and learn how to do French knots well, so that now that when I use them on fabric, they're really not a big deal. Honestly, I don't know why I ever made such a big deal out of them, because they're really easy now. But it's because I was able to practice doing them on perforated paper and kind of fine-tuning the process, and now it's actually quite easy to do them and to do them well. By the end of this video, you'll have all the skills necessary to complete your very own Mill Hill buttons and beads kit, and to frame it and display it and show it off to your family and friends. Looking ahead to Cross Stitch 102, we'll be switching our focus to stitching on Aida and stitching a full coverage or not quite full coverage project. I'll show on that in Cross Stitch 102. I'll show how I do gridding, how to stitch on the diagonal, how to start in any corner of the project that you like, how to stitch in rows or columns, whichever you prefer, and my needle parking method that I use on my full coverage or almost full coverage projects that I'm finding gives me really great results. I'm going to continue to focus on all of the skills needed and what are the things that you need to focus on to make sure that your stitches are coming out as pretty as you can make them, so that your final project will be beautiful. For now, let's switch back to our buttons and bead kit and the techniques needed for finishing them, so the specialty stitches, the beading, and the framing process. I hope you've enjoyed what I've had to show you in this series so far. I hope you will continue to join me as I progress through this project. It's been a really fun project to work on, planning out how to teach cross stitch on video to absolute beginners, or to give a good overview for more experienced stitchers of the many of the commonly used techniques in cross stitch. So here we go, the last video in Cross Stitch 101. How to get all of the rest of the project done and framed and ready to display. I hope you find this helpful. Now that you have all the cross stitching done on your kit, let's take a look at what are the finishing stitches for these Mill Hill kits. There's a good chance that you're not going to have all 4 of these that occur in your particular kit. These are just the ones that occur in Mill Hill kits and different ones. For example, on the kit that I'm working on right now, the only one I have is straight stitch. But I have done back stitch on other ones and long back stitch on other ones also. So there's really not like a huge difference between how you do these stitches. So straight stitch is very straightforward. That's the name. You come up in a hole and you go down in the hole that it tells you to go down in. So these are going to be longer individual stitches on top of your stitching that outline things or add other features like pine needles or branches or stuff like that. Back stitches, like the name implies, you work them backwards. And when you're back stitching, it's every hole that you're going to go down in. So you come out at 1, go down at 2. So you're basically just going backwards. And then you'll come up at 3, go down at 4, come up at 5, go down at 6. You might have a diagonal like here coming up at 7 and going down at 8. But the key, if it's telling you to do back stitch, is that you want these lengths to be as short as you can make them. So basically coming up in a hole and going down immediately in the next hole, either straight or up or at the diagonal. So that's a back stitch. Back stitching gives you a pretty subtle effect. And I'll show you a picture and some examples of these in a second. Straight stitches and long back stitches are going to be a more dramatic effect. Now, these finishing stitches, it's really up to you which ones you want to use. I have switched these out based on my own personal preference. So sometimes I'll do a back stitch when a straight stitch is called for, or a long back stitch, or vice versa. So this is going to be more subtle, and these two are going to give you a more dramatic effect. These are often done with one strand of floss. Backstitching is almost always with one strand of floss. Long back stitch and straight stitch can be 1 or 2. All of these, you're going to have to do the buried tail method to anchor the floss on the back. You can't use the loop method because you're not doing cross stitch anymore. You're doing finishing stitches. The way I look at these types of stitches is it's basically like when you're getting ready for the evening, you've gotten dressed. That means that you've completed your cross stitching and now you're putting on your makeup. And how you do your makeup is up to you and what kind of effect you want. So these are types of things that you can play around with to see what works for you, what you like on your pattern. So here's an example of one of these kits. So right here in the window, this is back stitched. So you can, it's going down every single hole. This smoke up here has got some longer back stitches in it and then some shorter ones also. Here around the window is long back stitch. Here's a project that I completed some years ago. And you can see right here, these are the long back stitches. These are in 2 strands of floss. The snowflakes also have long stitches, but those are in 1 strand of floss. And then the little branchy bits on the snowflakes are back stitching. So you can see the difference in how much more dramatic this looks compared to these little branches on the snowflakes. So play around with this to see what works for you. On these kits, it's often that I'll try something and then I don't like it and I'll rip it out and I'll try something else. This type of stitching is going to go very quickly compared to the cross stitching. I have a few more long stitches to put into this project. There's very few specialty stitches in this one, but I want to show you a few tricks for how I do this. So I need to start a new thread, and this is where my next stitch, my next long stitch is going to go. So I'll just put the needle through the project because that tells me where I need to anchor my thread so that I'm anchoring it nearby. And because I'm using a single strand of floss, I'll actually double anchor this because otherwise it's just too easy to pull that buried tail out. So I am right here. And then I'm down here. So looking on the back, this is a pretty long length to carry. I don't like having this long of a thread on the back. It's just too easy for it to get caught in something and damage the stitches on the front. It's just best practice to not have big long carried threads, though you can see that, yeah, there's some spots where I have, but Even this one, you can see that I carried from there to there and I buried halfway so it wouldn't be just a full long length. So I'm going to do the same thing here. I need to get down to that spot, and I don't make a big deal out of it. It's not like I'm going to make this all that pretty, but just tunnel through so that I don't have that big long carried thread on the back. And all I need to do is just end this thread, and all my specialty stitches are done. And the last thing I need to do is to bead this. I really like this kit and turned out really well. I'm going to show you how to do French knots. Learning how to do French knots is great on this perforated paper because it's stiff and it doesn't give like fabric does. French knots on fabric are notorious for popping through to the back side if you're not careful. So what I would recommend is that you practice doing French knots with 3 strands of floss, even if your pattern calls for 2. It's just easier to manage, it's easier to see what's going on, and then once you have it down with 3, then you can cut back to 2. On your project, what I would recommend doing is just to use the margins for practice space. Start your floss with just an X like that because it's going to be a lot easier to frog than if you bury the tail. So I'm going to show you actually 2 styles of knots. The first one is the French knot, and I'll show you with my left hand, and then I'll attempt to show you with my right. So you come up, and then you hold the needle in your dominant hand, and then you're going to wrap twice around the needle. It doesn't matter which direction you wrap, clockwise or counterclockwise, it doesn't matter. You want to pull the thread nice and tight with your non-dominant hand and just kind of hold tension on that thread, and you're going to go down in the same hole. Now this going down in the same hole is unique for perforated paper. I'll explain a bit later how you would do this on fabric. Notice that I'm still holding tension on that floss, and I'm going to continue doing that so as I pull through. But before I pull through, I just make sure that everything's in place, that my wraps are down at the paper, that my needle is nice and straight up, that I've got tension on the thread that's coming off of the knot, and then I'm just going to very gently pull through nice and slow. And at the very end, you can just let go and just pull it down, and there's your knot. So let's try that again. Come up, wrap the needle twice, doesn't matter which direction. Keep tension on that thread. Put the needle in. Get it so that everything's in place, so that you've got tension on the thread coming off. And that, see, I actually stopped to put my finger closer to the needle so that I can hold tension on the thread until the very last. Once I'm happy with how everything's looking, now I gently pull through and seat the knot, and you get some really nice knots that way. So let's try this with my right hand. So same thing, wrap twice, hold tension, put the needle down, get everything under control. That's why using these magnet boards are great, because everything is just supported and you can nice and calmly pull everything through. The thing that'll screw up knots is if you get anxious about them, and that's when they start becoming a problem. So that's French knots. The other style of knot is called the colonial knot. And what you're going to do is you're going to wrap a figure 8 on your needle. It's like a clove hitch. So the way to do that is you hold tension and you're going to scoop. So you lay your needle down, pointing to the right, and then you're going to scoop and point it back to the left. Come back around, So now I'm just going to relax the thread, and you can see that the thread that I'm tugging on with my right hand is coming off the back side of the wrap, not the front side like with the French knot. I need to wrap one more time. I'm going to come towards me. To check if you have it wrapped correctly, you kind of relax everything down. And if you look, you can see there's a figure 8. If you have that figure 8, you're right. You have your colonial knot correct. Put the needle in, hold tension, get everything nice and under control, and then pull through. So again, if you're a lefty, needle in your left hand, place it with the point pointing to the right, scoop behind. You get your wrap. Then with your right hand, you're going to wrap forward, check it, make sure you have your figure 8. Go down the hole, keep tension. And pull through. Okay, with your right hand, this is a little bit tricky for me. You're going to point your needle to the left, scoop back behind. So it's just the mirror image of what I did with my left hand. I'm going to wrap towards me, just like with the left hand. So the only difference between left and right hand is how you do the scoop. The second wrap is always towards you. So you bring your hand towards you and wrap that way. There's my figure 8. Keep tension. Get everything under control. And then pull through. French knots tend to freak people out. People won't, like I've seen lots of people say that they won't do a project if it has French knots. If you run into, like, later in your stitching experience, your career, or whatever you want to call it, if you come into a project that has a bunch of French knots on it, what I would recommend is just get yourself another one of these Mill Hill kits so you have the perforated paper, and just practice on perforated paper, because once you have it down here on fabric, it's really not a big deal. It's just a question of practice. So again, with your right hand, needle pointing left, scoop behind, wrap towards yourself. You have your figure 8. And pull through. So that's French knots with 3 strands of floss. Here's a close-up comparison of the 2 knots. Some people find making colonial knots to be easier. There is really no difference between the two. Colonial knots sit a little bit taller than French knots, but they're completely interchangeable. I've been practicing with 2 strands of floss. So again, I did the loop start there and just anchored with an X, the cross. And then with 2 strands of floss, I'm not really noticing that it's all that different. I'm just a little bit more gentle in how I seat the stitch. So when I get to the end, I'm especially gentle because I don't want to pop that knot through the paper. So that very last tug, I'm just taking a little bit of extra care that I didn't really have to do when I was just using 3 strands. But they work just the same. And that's really the only difference that I'm noticing doing 2 strands, regardless of whether I'm doing French or colonial. It's just that very last little bit where, as I'm pulling right now, I'm just taking a little bit of extra care, and I didn't give this a jerk, because if I give this a tug, you can just pop. 2 strands of floss will just pop through the holes if you're not careful. So that's French knots. I would recommend starting with 3 strands of floss, and then switch over to 2, whatever your pattern calls for. And don't be afraid of French knots. This is a great place to learn how to do them. and they're really pretty. They can really open up a lot of patterns for you. It always makes me sad when I see people not doing a pattern because they don't want to do French knots. So perforated paper is the place to learn these. Let's look at how you do French knots on fabric. I've got some Aida here. So the process is almost exactly the same as on perforated paper, with one difference. Instead of going down in the same hole, you're going to go down right next to the hole, as close as you can to the hole. So you're actually piercing the fabric in the Aida block. And then you just pull through, and there's your knot. The reason you don't want to go down in the same hole is because fabric is flexible, and all you'll do is just pop the knot through the fabric to the back, and you obviously don't want to do that. So again, just as close, and that's a little too far. I like getting them as close to the hole as possible. So if you're thinking of the Aida block as a quadrant, as close to that bottom left corner as possible. Same thing with colonial knots. It's very straightforward to do on Aida. I'll be honest, I used to not like doing French knots, but ever since I've been practicing them on perforated paper, this is just, it's so easy to do now. And same thing with colonial knots. So oops, as long as you can keep it on your needle. I'm having to contort a little bit because of the camera, but just down near where you came up, and there's your knot. So practice on perforated paper and French knots will not be a problem. Beading the project is the last step before framing and completely finishing one of these Mill Hill buttons and beads kits. So I have my 2 bags of beads that came with my kit. These are all marked with an asterisk on my key, and these have nothing on the key. So that's how I can identify which colors are which. There's 2 greens, but because of that symbol, I know that this one is Christmas green and this one over here is emerald. I use one of these bead holder. This is a case that's like a little CD case, and it's tacky so that the beads don't fall off. Otherwise, they'll just go flying everywhere. I haven't found this available anywhere in beading or stitching shops, so I recommended just getting a beading mat. That's the same idea. It's this tacky substance that keeps your beads from flying all over. In your bag of beads, you have a beading needle that's very thin so that it can pass through all of these tiny beads, which also has a very tiny eye. So just poking the thread through that eye is pretty tricky. That's why you need a beading needle threader, so with this wire on it. It works the same way as the other needle threader. You just insert it in the eye. Now you're only going to go 1 strand through here. You're not going to be able to do a loop start with these beading needles because there's no way you could get 2 ends through that eye. It's just too small. Pulling the thread into the eye, these needle threaders with the wire, they have a real tendency to just pull apart. So the wire just pulls out of the plastic. So I always grab the wire to pull the floss through, and not the plastic so I don't break it. And then all you're gonna do is just square up your ends, and then you're gonna start your floss with the buried tail method. Most of the beading that I've seen with these Mill Hill kits is 2 strands of floss. So this is how you get your tiny eye on that beading needle threaded. So I've already started beading my my project, and there's actually 2 kinds of beads on here. The first kind is with only a half cross. So I'm just doing bottom left to top right inside of that bead, and you can see that these are all angled going this way. The it's important that all of my beads, everything that's half cross is going to get angled this direction for the entire project. I could have very easily had them angled this way, and as long as it's consistent for the entire project, it doesn't matter which one you do. On these tiny beads up here, you can see that they're all aligned vertically. They could also all be aligned horizontally. It doesn't matter as long as it's consistent for the entire project. And these things have a full cross inside of them. So this is a little bit more fiddly to do because you got to get that second leg of the X through the inside of the bead when it's already laying on the paper. I'm going to show you how to do the half cross first. I've been playing around with which one is easier to do, holding this and poke and pulling it, or supporting it with my magnets. And for me personally, I find that using the two-handed method, so using my magnets on the half crosses work. But honestly, for the full crosses, it's easier to poke and pull it. So I'll show you both methods. So one thing you have to be careful with on these projects is that now that this is got all this floss on it, it's got a bit of weight to it, especially once you start getting a bunch of beads on here. So it's something to pay attention to, is just to use your arm or your body even. If I could scoot close to this, just use my chest to hold this up. So that it's not drooping. It's not too bad yet, but if I had a bunch of beads down here, it could get a bit heavy, and so you have to be careful so that your paper doesn't distort. Oops, wrong end of the needle. So because these are bigger beads that are used with the half cross, I find it that I can manage to pick them up with my right hand just fine, even though I'm a lefty, and my right hand isn't as skilled as my left. But these things are big enough so I can manage it fine. And the increase in speed by doing two-handed stitching, I find it works just fine. So these are all just the same. On these kits, whenever I see that they're saying to use a half cross, I'm always happy because it's so much easier to do. The full crosses are a little bit fiddly. So that essentially is how you do your half crosses, your beads with the half cross. And you can try, it might be that you like it better just hand holding it and poke and pull, but I find that it works fine doing this two-handed. So just grab one more. Okay, so that's how you do the half cross. I'm just going to park this needle out of the way so it doesn't get caught on the other stuff. Just leave it there. Now for the full cross, I'm finding that it is actually easier to do this poke and pull, because it's just, these beads are so tiny, I'm struggling picking them up with my non-dominant right hand. So on these, for a lefty, if you're gonna poke and pull this, you just go bottom left to top right. So you make your X the same way each time. And if you look, you can see that the opening of the bead is aligned for my left hand to just pass that needle through, and then I just finish the X. So if you're a lefty, I would recommend that you just do your X the same way that you do your X inside the bead the same way that you do it for just your regular stitches, because it's the opening of the bead is aimed straight at your hand. And so it makes making this the second leg, which is a little bit fiddly to do, it just makes it a lot easier. So let's take a look at right-handers. So if you're a right-hander and you just do the X the same way, so bottom left to top right for your first leg, you can kind of see that you now have a problem, because the opening of the bead, you either have to come this way, but because I've set these guys up so that they're all vertical, if I come in from the top, I'm going to turn it so that it's horizontal. That would be fine if all my beads were horizontal, but they're not, they're all vertical. So I have to actually come around from this side, which is what's easier for lefties. So I'm just going to go back to my left hand. You can see that if I tried to do that stitch with my right hand, I'd have to contort my arm a little bit to be able to do it. So there is a solution for that. Going back to being right-handed again, is just to switch the legs. So instead of coming up in the bottom left, come up in the bottom right. Pick up your bead. And now the opening for the bead is nicely aligned so that you don't have to contort your arm. So this is something you can play around with, whichever handed you are, left or right, whether you want to come up in the bottom left or come up in the bottom right. You can vary that. You're not going to see the X inside of the bead, so it doesn't matter which way you cross it. If you want to cross it backwards from where you regularly do it in your stitching, that's complete, or in your regular just X's, that's fine. Wow, I cannot pick up this bead. So again, for a right-hander, switching the legs around makes it so that the bead is aligned so that it's easier for you to insert that needle. So with these full cross ones, it doesn't matter whether you align them all vertically or horizontally, as long as they're consistent. And you can play around with the X on the inside to make it more comfortable to do. The full crosses take a bit more time. The half crosses, that goes really quickly. The beading goes a lot quicker than all of the stitching. So if you're to the beading stage now, you're gonna get done pretty quickly. And then the last step will be to put this in the frame, and then you'll be done. As I was beading this area, I found a mistake. I had put a stitch in a spot where a bead belonged. And so I looked at it and I realized that, well, this whole leaf, this is like an ivy leaf or a holly leaf, needs to be outlined in green all the way. And without that one bead there, it looked a little weird. So I just put the bead on top of the stitch. You can see the brown poking out below. That's the wrong stitch. That's the wrong location for that X. So I just beat it up, put the bead on top of it, and it looks fine. I actually had to look for it a little bit to find where this was. So if you have a mistake, you can try just putting the bead on top of a stitch and see if the stitch below it just disappears, and then you can just fix your mistake that way. This is the most heavily beaded kit that I think I've ever done. And one of the things I was struggling with a little bit was when I beaded all of these green holly leaves, and then I went back to do the holly berries in red, some of these are full crosses on the inside, and it was a bit tricky to get my needle to actually just to pick my needle up once I put through that the second leg of the cross, my needle would just kind of get caught in between, below some of these beads. Or the other thing that was happening was I would start, as I'd pull through on the second leg of the X, the needle would insert into some of these green beads, into the hole of the green beads. So I just grabbed a pair of tweezers and used that to help grab the needle so that I wasn't having to dig in there with my fingers. And that worked well. The last thing left to do is to frame your project. If you look on the back of your chart, there's a section that tells you what the recommended color is for the frame that Mill Hill makes. But of course you can use whichever color frame you like. You're going to need some glazier points for your framing. They look like this. So each kit comes with a little dowel. If you want to display your project on a table, then you just jam the dowel into the hole. If you want to hang it on the wall, obviously you're not going to put the dowel. Then you just take your project and figure out which is the right side up. Make sure that you're setting it up so that it's the right way. You put the cardboard backing on top. And then this is made out of really soft wood. So I haven't really found the need to use a hammer to insert these glazier points. I just use a screwdriver. I place my hand out of the way in case this slips, that I'm not going to end up jamming my screwdriver into my hand. And then you just push that glazier point into the wood. No, I don't seat the points all the way in. I don't think that's a problem. I haven't never had a problem with these things coming out. In fact, the last one that I did, I didn't even use a screwdriver. I just used my fingers to push it in, and that works just fine. So you can put as many of these on as you think you need. I think 4 is probably plenty. And then the last thing to do is to look on the front and just get it centered. You can kind of scoot it around. It's actually that way. And that's it. And there's your finished project. I really enjoy stitching these kits. I hope you enjoyed it too. So that's it for all of the skills needed for completing your very own Mill Hill buttons and beads kit. I hope you'll get your project done soon and you'll have it to frame and display and show off to your family and friends. I also hope you'll join me for Cross Stitch 102 as we switch our focus to stitching on Aida and working on full coverage or almost full coverage projects. I really appreciate you joining me in this adventure on YouTube. I've been having so much fun planning out and filming these videos and learning all kinds of techniques in how to do videos and editing and all the rest of it. So until next time, I hope you have a good day.